Today is August 9th, 2023. I want to talk about the ongoing conflict in Ukraine, and I want to talk specifically about the ongoing Ukrainian offensive, which has now passed the 2-month mark. And we are now in the 3rd month of fighting amid this Ukrainian offensive. And I want to take a look at the live map. This is liveuamap.com. This is a pro-Ukrainian live map, so keep that in mind when we look at it, and we can see that the line of contact has barely changed. There's been hardly any changes in the line of contact. We see these red rifle icons. This means that Russian forces are on the advance, and we see areas here, Robotino. This was supposedly taken by Ukraine, according to this map. That has not been confirmed. As a matter of fact, it has been confirmed that that did not happen. And they are even indicating rifle icons, red rifle icons, indicating Russian forces are in these areas, not Ukrainian forces. If we zoom out, we can see that there are these long-range attacks in Crimea. We've heard about the drone attacks on shipping through the Black Sea, also on Russian naval vessels, and we see a steady stream of news stories about these drone attacks in and around Moscow. And this is because the offensive has stopped. It is ground to a halt. Ukrainian forces are not making the progress they expected to. They need to demonstrate to the world that somehow they have the initiative, and they are doing so by carrying out these attacks. But in terms of strategically hindering Russia's military operations in Ukraine, these attacks do nothing to accomplish that. They are purely for political value. The offensive is in such a bad state right now that even the Western media is beginning to admit something is wrong. Let's look at this article here from Vox. What went wrong in Ukraine's counteroffensive and what's changed now? And that kind of suggests the possibility that things are better, but if you actually read through the article, it is extremely bleak. The article says Ukraine had tried to tamp down expectations about the counteroffensive long before it had begun. Their own expectations that it would be wildly successful. They ended up having to tamp that down before it began. But Kiev's past successes and Moscow's past failures, the deliveries of new advanced Western weapons, and a fresh crop of Western-trained Ukrainian recruits had all had a lot of folks very hyped, maybe overly so, about what Kiev could achieve. But that would only have worked if you took that at face value and you didn't think about any of these things they were talking about, these so-called successes by Ukraine. I'm going to get into that. And again, they're referring to Kharkov and Kherson last year, the supposed mistakes that Russia made. And they're talking about the withdrawal from, say, Kiev, or the withdrawal from Snake Island. All of these instances that have been misinterpreted by Western analysts, by the Western media, by Western military and political leaders. All of these misinterpretations helped fuel the misconception that this Ukrainian offensive was going to be much more successful than it actually has turned out to be. The article continues. It says, Western equipment can withstand a lot, but vast minefields are vast minefields, and Kiev and its newly trained forces have largely failed at conducting combined arms operations on a large scale. That is, coordinating troops and all this different weaponry like armored vehicles and artillery to blitz through Russian lines. Kiev has also suffered high casualties in its attempts to do so. Ukraine knows this and has now shifted strategies to a much more attritional approach, trying to degrade Russian forces and logistics as it focuses its operations on 3 axes of attack. And now here's a New York Times article, very, very similar in nature. It's not a sprint, Ukraine's Marines insist. It's a marathon. Journalists from the Times spent 2 weeks with troops from brigades trained and supplied by NATO to get their take on how and where the counteroffensive is going. And the article says they all have a strong sense of urgency. We have to do this fast, one said, but they also warned that the fight would be long and hard. A lot of people thought it would be very fast, and in the autumn, we thought we would be in Crimea. But every meter of the tree line is very difficult. It's not a sprint, it is a marathon. However, to believe all of this, to believe that Ukraine can shift from trying to storm Russian defenses to an attritional approach, or to think that they can turn this into a marathon rather than achieve everything in a sprint. This is as flawed as thinking the offensive was going to be successful in the first place. There was a very specific reason why Ukraine and their NATO sponsors chose to storm Russian positions rather than conduct this as an attritional marathon. There's a very specific reason. We all know what that reason is. They lack the trained manpower, the armor, the artillery, and the ammunition to draw this out in a long attritional way. This is how Russia prefers to fight. This is how Russia prepared for this conflict. This is not what Ukraine and its NATO sponsors are prepared for. Alexander Mikuris of the Duran, he brought this up in one of his recent videos. He was talking about how US military planners for years proposed that the best way to attack the Russian battalion tactical group, this is one of the basic building blocks Russia uses to organize its military, at least it was at the beginning of the special military operation. The best way to approach and defeat the battalion tactical group, because it is such a heavy concentration of long-range firepower, was to storm towards it, to close that gap as quickly as possible, and then begin inflicting casualties on Russian forces, compelling the commanders of the battalion tactical groups to withdraw because they are adverse to casualties. They would rather withdraw than stand and fight. There's a heavy concentration of high-tech, capable firepower. They do not want to lose it by standing and fighting. And that had been the concept that you could see Ukraine was basing its operations off of. Last year at Kherson, that was the plan. This year, during the offensive, that was the plan. And I talked about this, and I showed a paper written years ago, published by the U.S. Army Maneuver Center of Excellence, Defeating the Russian Battalion Tactical Group by Captain Nicholas Fiore. And it says, although some battalion tactical group systems are technologically superior to the corresponding U.S. equipment, because even back then, it was well known to the U.S. military that Russia did not have inferior weapons. They had weapons that were comparable to U.S. systems. They also had weapons that were far better than anything the U.S. possessed. They understood that even at the time. It was only recently that Western propaganda tried to paper over that fact and pretend that everything Russia had was inferior, incapable, antiquated, and operated by incompetent troops. So this paper says, although some battalion tactical group systems are technologically superior to the corresponding U.S. equipment, the battalion tactical group doesn't have the capacity to observe, target, and attack the brigade combat team simultaneously across a broad front. They're talking about a U.S. Army brigade combat team, which is much larger than a battalion tactical group. The Russian battalion tactical group is between 800 to 1,000 troops. The U.S. brigade combat team is much larger, around 3,000 to 4,000. Or if we're talking about Ukraine, 3,000 to 4,000. That is the typical brigade that they were trying to build up around this U.S. Army concept of defeating the battalion tactical group. The paper continues, it says, not only can a brigade combat team sustainably maneuver 3 times as many formations, the decentralized nature of U.S. mission command allows each formation to maneuver simultaneously, independent of brigade-level direction. Brigade combat team commanders can maneuver against battalion tactical groups' vulnerabilities by avoiding static deployments of forces that allow the battalion tactical group commander to select, prepare, and execute limited strikes. And in other words, you have many more troops than the Russians do. They have a huge amount of firepower that you don't. You spread your troops out. You break them out into smaller groups that can independently navigate across the battlefield toward the battalion tactical group. And what you do is overwhelm their ability to target and destroy everyone that's crossing the field. You cannot possibly attack and kill everyone crossing the battlefield. Someone is going to make it. When they make it, they're going to inflict heavy losses on the battalion tactical group at close range, and they will compel the battalion tactical group to move, to withdraw. And this is exactly what they were trying to do in Kherson last year during Ukraine's offensive in the fall, and that is exactly what they've been trying to do along the line of contact in Zaporozhye in the south, and now in the east around Bakhmut. This is exactly what they were trying to do. The paper continues, it goes on, it says the battalion tactical group capabilities are extremely lethal when concentrated against individual units, but diminish rapidly against high-tempo distributed maneuver or defense in depth, because a battalion tactical group can't resource economy of force missions. In contrast, American brigade combat teams have asymmetrical advantages in maneuver and sustainment, which can be leveraged against a battalion tactical group. To defeat a battalion tactical group, increase uncertainty and shape the battlefield by burning more calories to overload the battalion tactical group's commander's most valuable systems and personnel, like drones overhead, picking targets and directing fire missions. Once hostilities are initiated, attack on multiple fronts to destroy his maneuver force, displace his mission command, electronic warfare, and fires assets, and seize his sustainment area. And this is all you hear Ukraine talk about. We're going to hit their sustainment areas, their logistics, their command and control. We're going to hit all of these things. We're going to use our artillery advantage, which Ukraine does not actually have over Russia. They're going to use their artillery to take out Russian artillery, Russian electronic warfare, almost verbatim what was written in this paper back in 2017. That was the whole plan, and that had to be the plan because Ukraine does not have the artillery guns or the ammunition. They don't have air power. They don't have the armor. They don't have the trained manpower. They don't have the resources, the men and materiel to fight Russia toe-to-toe in long-range fires. They cannot compete in a war of attrition against Russia, doing this long-range, incremental, attritional warfare that Russia itself prefers. They cannot do that. That is why they picked to storm Russian positions in this manner. And they weren't able to. And if you read this paper carefully, and I'll put the link to it in the video description below, if you read it carefully, they talk about the advantages that the American brigade combat team has. They talk about its command and control. They're talking about sustainment and logistics. These are things that the US military is able to do because it has trained its military to do these things over decades. Ukraine's military cannot do this. You cannot train them to do this in 3 weeks. It is impossible. And as a matter of fact, the New York Times article begins to admit this. So the same New York Times article here, talking about how it's not a sprint, it's a marathon. This same article admits the new brigades are made up of recruits fresh from basic training after they were called up or volunteered to join the military this year. So these are men who had no previous military experience. They were given maybe 3 weeks of training by NATO trainers outside of Ukraine, not in their native language, most likely in English or through the use of a translator. And then they were sent into combat. That is disastrous. And I've talked about how basic entry-level infantrymen will go through between 5 to 6 months of training before they even reach their unit. And once they reach their unit, they go under much more training, intensive training with their unit before they ever see action. New York Times continues, soldiers along the front line blamed commanders for pushing raw recruits into battle and using untested units to spearhead the counteroffensive. Others criticized the inadequacy of the few weeks of basic training in various NATO countries, just what I was talking about, and what I have been talking about for over half a year now. A few complained that some of the Western vehicles were inappropriate for the task. In particular, they pointed to American Max Pros, armored vehicles that were designed for fighting in counterinsurgency rather than facing the firepower of the Russian army. And again, something that I've been talking about for over half a year, whether it's M777s, HIMARS, Leopard 2 main battle tanks, whatever the system is, the West prepared to fight in a very specific way. And over the last several decades, they've prepared to fight these small wars all around the globe against irregular forces in underdeveloped or failed states. They were not prepared to fight against a peer or near-peer competitor. They were not prepared to fight the scale that the Russian military operates on. The New York Times goes on and it says, the heavy losses were not a shock to them. Most of their commanders said that they had seen units, including their own, decimated at times during the past 16 months of fighting. The battalion commander said that casualties were so high during the counteroffensive in Kherson last year that he had been forced to replace the members of his unit 3 times. And do you remember then I said they traded their army in for territory? It was a war of attrition, and Ukraine's offensive, both in Kherson and Kharkov, traded in their army, their men, their equipment for that territory. And when the offensive reached its end, they had to wait for NATO essentially to transfer a whole army's worth of equipment and trained manpower to them to launch this offensive. And when we hear people skeptical of, say, Russian claims of Ukrainian losses, this is the New York Times citing Ukrainians saying that their forces have been decimated. They are suffering heavy losses. This is not Russian propaganda. This is from the Western media citing Ukrainian sources on the ground facing Russian forces. In Kherson last year, they honestly believed that if they used this tactic of attacking across a broad front, small units, overwhelming the battalion tactical group's ability to target them and destroy them fast enough before they closed the gap, they honestly believed that they could compel Russian forces to withdraw. I believe that NATO planners thought that if only we gave Ukrainians NATO main battle tanks, NATO infantry fighting vehicles, if we surge whatever remaining artillery ammunition we have left, if only we did all of these things, we could finally make this tactic of storming Russian positions, overwhelming the battalion tactical group and compelling them to flee. We can make that work. And I think that that's what they were working on for this offense. This is just speculation. We'll never know. But that's what I suspect happened. The problem is Russia isn't using battalion tactical groups as their defensive strategy. They have what looks to be more of a divisional level defensive position. They have adapted. And in addition to that, they have created physical fortifications in layers across the battlefield. So the idea of using this tactic described in a 2017 paper to defeat the battalion tactical group in a hypothetical setting, the idea that that would work against layered defenses involving much larger Russian units was never going to work. It was never feasible. Now, where are we right now? We're still looking at an offensive. Ukraine is still trying to carry out this offensive. We don't know what the disposition of Ukrainian or Russian troops are for sure. We do know that even the Western media, Western analysts, are admitting that Ukrainian units that were meant to break through Russian defensive lines have exhausted themselves without breaking through. Now they're bringing in units that were supposed to exploit the breakthrough. They're being brought up so that they can try to break through these lines. Who is going to exploit the breakthrough if and when it happens? And this brings me back to what I've been saying for months before the offensive even began. It doesn't even matter. It doesn't matter if they break through. It doesn't matter how far they go. Their military is exhausted. They do not have the ability to reconstitute these brigades that have been badly mauled in this offensive. And even NATO is going to struggle significantly to even come close to building up another force and transferring one of this size to Ukraine again ahead of their next attempted offensive, if there is even another attempted offensive. Another point I want to bring up is just the whole idea of the offensive in the first place. It was to cut the land bridge. It was to cut the land bridge. It was also meant to bring Ukrainian weapons in range of the Crimean bridge so they could fire on and destroy that bridge, and then supposedly isolate Crimea. And as I've explained, Crimea has been part of Russia since 2014. The Crimean Bridge wasn't built until years later, and it was only as recently as last year that the land bridge was established. Russia was able to sustain the civilian population and their military installations on the Crimean Peninsula without a bridge of any kind for years, and they will be able to do so for years to come if somehow the land bridge was cut and the Crimean Bridge was destroyed. They would still be able to sustain at least military operations on the peninsula for years. They've been sustaining military operations in Syria using only air power and sea lift capabilities. They don't have roads or rail going all the way to Syria, bringing in supplies for their troops there. So the whole premise of the offensive was flawed from the very beginning. It made no sense, and a lot of this really is just about public relations and political posturing than any sort of actual tactical or strategic plan. Now, speaking of Syria, let's refresh our memories in regards to how the US proxy war against Syria unfolded. Everything that was said then, especially about the Russian intervention in 2015 at the invitation of the Syrian government, how it was reported then and how things actually turned out. Just to give us at least one possible outcome for the current conflict in Ukraine. The story goes that people began spontaneously rising up all across the Arab world. In 2011, this was the so-called Arab Spring. I have extensively demonstrated how that was actually planned out by the US years in advance through organizations like the National Endowment for Democracy, training agitators in the US, in Europe, and sending them back to their countries to create unrest. At the same time, Seymour Hersh, again, years before the Arab Spring began, was talking about the US arming, equipping extremists all across the Arab world for, again, a likewise an uprising, an armed uprising. And in 2011, the political protests gave cover so that these pre-prepared armed militants could rise up. And from that point onward, the US was arming and backing and covertly supporting these militants. And we know that because we have articles like this in the New York Times. This was from 2013. Arms airlift to Syria rebels expands with aid from CIA. And if you read the details, it actually began in 2012. Less than a year after it began, it says the airlift, which began on a small scale in early 2012 and continued intermittently through last fall, expanded into a steady and much heavier flow late last year. The data shows it has grown to include more than 160 military cargo flights by Jordanian, Saudi, and Qatari military-style cargo planes. As it evolved, the airlift correlated with shifts in the war within Syria as rebels drove Syria's army from territory by the middle of last year. And a lot of people like to imagine that these protesters just spontaneously armed themselves and they were stealing weapons from Syrian Arab army armories, and that was how they were sustaining their fight. But that's not how warfare actually works. They had a steady stream of weapons, ammunition, and supplies pouring over the border from Turkey, from Jordan, supplying them. It was US-sponsored proxy warfare, and it could not have happened without US support. That required state sponsorship. The US was sponsoring them. By 2014, we had articles like this. So they were covertly arming, backing, organizing these militant forces, but they needed something much larger to deliver the killing blow to the Syrian government. And so we had articles like this from the Brookings Institution, one of these US government and industry funded think tanks, An Army to Defeat Assad, How to Turn Syria's Opposition into a Real Fighting Force. And it would claim that the US could create a new Syrian military with a conventional structure and doctrine, one capable of defeating both the regime and the extremists. But although the rebels were the extremists, that was the catch that they never admitted to, but knew all along. And the idea that you can build an army out of thin air in the middle of a war sounds very familiar, because that is exactly what the West and the rest of NATO are claiming they're going to do now. In Ukraine, they're going to build an entire army's worth of men and and equipment, and they're going to give it to Ukraine, and they're going to launch a successful offensive. And now we read from the New York Times that that was implausible, could not have worked. In 2015, the Russian military intervened, and I want to go over a couple of articles regarding how that was perceived then, and I want you to ask yourself if any of this seems familiar. From the Washington Post, Russia's military is unlikely to turn the tide in Syria's war. It says, Moscow's contribution is unlikely to be decisive in the war, analysts said. While Russia boasts its military stronger than it has been in 25 years, its forces still grapple with aging equipment and have a weak partner in the poorly trained Syrian army. There is also tepid support among the Russian public for a lengthy conflict. And what they fail to mention is that however well or unwell Syrian army training is, these militants that are being scraped together by the CIA, their training is even worse. How about this from the New York Times? A US politician, the president of the United States, no less, is going to weigh in. Obama sees Russia failing in Syria efforts. And it says, an attempt by Russia and Iran to prop up Assad and try to pacify the population is just going to get them stuck in a quagmire, and it won't work, Mr. Obama said. Here's Vox. So Vox now admitting that the Ukrainian offensive is a complete disaster. This was them back in 2015. Why Putin is doomed to fail in Syria. Russia will merely entrench the status quo in Syria, worsening conditions without fundamentally altering them, and miring what is presently a small but politically embarrassing Russian force in a Mid-East quagmire. At worst, this will deepen the very problems that Putin is hoping to solve, exasperating both his own isolation and the armed movement extremist and non-extremist encircling Assad in Syria. And yet, all of these predictions turned out to be 100% wrong. They couldn't be more wrong. When Russia intervened, their warplanes began bombing the supply lines between these militants holding these cities and these different positions all across Syria and their sponsors, their NATO sponsors in Turkey and in Jordan. When they began hitting those supply lines, they isolated these militants, and their capacity, their fighting capacity, began to collapse. And at the same time, Russia and Iran were helping the Syrian Arab army on the ground move in and wipe these militants out of the cities they occupied. They took back almost all of Syria's main population centers, save for Idlib, and east of the Euphrates, that is still beyond the reach of Syrian forces, the Syrian government. And that's only because the United States is militarily occupying east of the Euphrates in Syria. Turkey is still occupying northern Syria, Idlib. And these are the only two areas Syria, with Russian and Iranian support, was not able to reincorporate into its territory. By 2018, you had articles like this: the demise of the Free Syrian Army. So the idea was to create a Free Syrian Army that was going to fight and overthrow the Syrian government. This is what Brookings Institution was describing years ago, and now it is gone. And all of the fighters who were part of it, they all melted back into Idlib or east of the Euphrates into U.S. occupied territory. That's where they stay. The Russian military intervention was a decisive victory, and the best that the US and their allies could do was freeze the conflict. Remember, Vox talking about Russia being more isolated after its intervention in Syria. It turns out the exact opposite has happened. Russia is more popular in the Middle East than ever. China is increasingly popular and playing a very constructive role there. Iran and Saudi Arabia have repaired their relations. Saudi Arabia had been one of the central sponsors, the US strong-armed, into supporting the proxy war in Syria. And now it's the United States who is looking more and more isolated in the Middle East. Its military forces are surrounded in Syria by irregular forces who are carrying out military attacks on their illegal bases there. So the exact opposite actually took place. It was not Russia that became isolated, it was the United States. Now, does all of this sound familiar? This sounds exactly like what the Western media, Western political leaders, Western military leaders all tried to convince us was happening in regards to Ukraine, how Russia was becoming isolated, how Russia's military was failing to perform on the battlefield. We heard all of these stories before. At one point, the Western media and US political and military leaders tried to convince us that Russian President Vladimir Putin was in a fantasy world detached from reality. This is from the New York Times in March 2022. US intelligence suggests that Putin's advisors misinformed him on Ukraine, that he had yes men surrounding him, only telling him what he wanted to hear, not what was really going on. And that's why the situation was so bad for Russia from the very beginning, and how it was never going to improve. Compare that article last year to this one from CNN just this month. Western allies receive increasingly sobering updates on Ukraine's counteroffensive. This is the most difficult time of the war. How do you reconcile this with this? You could only reconcile it if there were indeed yes men, but they were misleading people somewhere else other than in the Kremlin. After the Ukrainian offensive exhausts itself, Ukrainian forces are still going to be receiving weapons and ammunition from the West, just not enough to mount any sort of significant offensive or even defensive operation, but they will have enough weapons to make it extremely costly for Russian forces to carry out any sort of big arrow offensive. And I believe Russia is going to, again, it's going to continue pushing incrementally across the battlefield, very carefully, dismantling Ukrainian defenses, using their advantage in long-range fires, and pushing back and obtaining whatever their ultimate objectives are, whatever they are politically and in terms of territory. And Russia will continue taking whatever territory that it wants, unless, of course, the US and its allies do exactly in Ukraine what they did in Syria, and that is create a buffer zone where they hope Russia will dare not strike, and they can freeze the conflict. But even if they manage to freeze the conflict, we have to think about all of the external factors that have created this situation for the West in the first place. Their inability to maintain hegemony, this idea of maintaining primacy across the globe and eliminating all of their peer and near-peer competitors, encircling and containing Russia and also China. The reasons they are unable to actually do this is because of these external factors. And I would say first and foremost among them is economics, and more specifically industry. I had Alex Christoforou and Alexander Mikuras of the Duran on my live stream last week, and we were talking about industry. And we were talking about the difference between industry in the West and its decline, and industry in Russia and China, and how it is continuously expanding, and how this, above all else, gives Russia and China the advantage over the West in any one of these proxy wars that we see unfolding. And this is an advantage that continues to grow in favor of Russia and China, and it is a problem that continuously compounds for the West. And we see numbers like GDP. You will see lists like this: top manufacturing countries in the world, and the metric that they're using is value. And this is very similar to Russia is 10, China is 1, the United States is 2. We see Germany in there, the United Kingdom, France. What does this number value actually mean? It means if you are making fewer things, but you're getting more money from them, that makes you a larger manufacturing country than another nation. I think it is a very flawed metric to use. And if you look at other things, like say shipbuilding, you will see that Russia continues to build ships every year. The United States and Europe, their shipbuilding industries are in decline. Articles like this, shipbuilding capacity And they talk about Chinese shipbuilding capacity versus the United States and what a mismatch it is. Commercial shipbuilding industry in the United States is nearly gone. They talk about how US shipyards can't build more than 3 destroyers a year. They have to pick between destroyers and submarines. Russia commissions 2 warships and 1 submarine in 2022. This article here from the Daily Beast, hardly a pro-Russian source, and David Axe, a very vocal supporter of Ukraine. Russia's building warships faster than America or even China. And they're talking about the number of the ships. They may be smaller, they may be less capable in terms of range out at sea, but they are making a lot of them. They have the ability to do that. Russian combat aircraft production sustained despite sanctions. This is February this year, a year into the special military operation. Russia continues to build warplanes. And this article that I talked about many months ago, June 2022, the return of industrial warfare, and the advantage Russia has in terms of military industrial output, saying nothing of the advantage China has. And I talked about at length the number of shells alone that Russia is able to produce now is more than the US and Europe will be able to produce after they expand production by 2027, years from now. This is the reality. We see numbers like the GDP or the value of manufacturing in each country, but when we actually look at the physical, tangible output of Russia's industry versus the West's industry, we can see that it is not the mismatch in favor of the West that we are led to believe it is. And it's more than a matter of just expanding your production lines. There are many, many factors that underpin a successful, profitable, and very productive industrial sector. One of them is education. This is from Forbes. Countries with the most STEM graduates. STEM stands for science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. And I often show people this to compare US STEM graduates with Chinese STEM graduates. China graduates millions more every single year in STEM fields than the United States. Russia, which has a smaller overall population than the US, has a comparable number of STEM graduates. What does that tell you? What does that tell you about the state of education in Russia versus the state of education in the United States, or even Europe for that matter? It is more geared to investing into its industry than in the US. That's what it tells us. The West's entire economy is obsessed with profit first and foremost above all else. Russia and China create an arms industry and economies that focus on a purpose. While fulfilling their purpose, they do make profits. Profits are not irrelevant. They are extremely important, but they should not be the reason your industry exists. There should be purposes for your industry to exist. The defense industry should exist to provide for the defense of the nation, not merely make profits, and then as a byproduct produce weapons and ammunition that could potentially be used to defend the nation. That is what the United States does. It has an industry entirely focused on profits. They do not have the extra industrial capacity for a scenario like this that we see unfolding in Ukraine, because it's not profitable to do so. Russia maintained that despite it being unprofitable, and yet here they are enjoying the advantage because they had the foresight to do so, and they put purpose before profit. And I assure you, they're still making profits. The US failed in Syria. They're failing in Ukraine. They will fail in the Pacific in any war they provoke with China. You cannot provoke a war with another nation that has a larger military industrial output than you and expect to win a war against them. It is one of these fundamental factors that will determine a war long before the first shot is ever fired. The political establishment in the West, driving Western foreign policy, is obsessed with the idea of hegemony and primacy. They don't really care about whether it's plausible or not. They're still pursuing it. However, in practical, the West can exist as a constructive member in a multipolar world, and the rest of the world would very much like to do work with the West. And as Alex Christoforou so expertly pointed out in our live stream, he said, if the West doesn't make this decision themselves to transition away from unipolarism to multipolarism, the choice is going to be made for them. I will keep a close eye on the ongoing Ukrainian offensive amid the much wider ongoing Ukrainian conflict. If you thought this video was useful, please like and share. Think about subscribing. It's free to do, and it helps the channel grow. Check the video description below for other places you can find and follow my work, as well as for all of the links that I referenced while making this video, as well as for ways you can help support my work. I do not monetize my YouTube channel. If an ad pops up, feel free to skip it. If you do want to support my work, please do so through Buy Me a Coffee and also Patreon. To everyone who has been helping out, thank you so much. Without that support, this work would be impossible. So thank you again. And as always, thank you for watching.